Good evening, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to the Mahindra Humanities Center for this very happy, special event to discuss and to celebrate the publication of Durba Mitra's new book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social. Speaking as one of Durba's colleagues, I know I'm not alone in being deeply inspired not only by Durba's scholarship, but by her catalytic presence on campus. And it's really been a joy to work with Durba for the last couple of years. To help us discuss this very, very rich book, we are very happy to have Professor Sharon Marcus from Columbia University, where she's the Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature. Professor Marcus specializes in 19th century British and French culture. She's the author most recently of The Drama of Celebrity and co-founded Public Book, which many of us are familiar with. Equally delighted to welcome Professor Lisa Lowe, the Samuel Knight Professor of American Studies at Yale University. Professor Lowe is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work is concerned with the analysis of race, immigration, capitalism, and colonialism. And her 2015 book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, I think can very safely be called field transforming. So, thank you all for coming out. I've been told the only housekeeping notice I have to make is please keep the aisles clear or we will get into trouble. It's great to see so many people out this evening. The way it's going to work is Durba will start with a 15-minute presentation of her work, followed by comments from Lisa and Sharon, a panel discussion among the three of them, and then we should have plenty of time to open it up to all of you. So thank you very much and welcome, Durba. Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sunil, to Sunil Amrit and Steve Beal, to Mary and Daria at the Mahindra Center, and everyone at the Mahindra, and especially Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, in particular Amy Parker and Sophie Wetzig for their work in putting this event together. Thank you most especially to Sharon Marcus and Lisa Lowe for their intellectual generosity, for taking time out of the busiest time of the semester to travel here and speak on the book. I have the privilege of being in Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality here at Harvard, and I thank all of my colleagues in WGS for being kind, truly supportive, and engaged colleagues. And finally, I want to take this opportunity, hopefully someone is recording, to thank my mother, Rupa, whose example and intellectual life has been the driving force of this project. My book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, is an account of how ideas about deviant female sexuality, often named as the prostitute, became foundational to modern social thought in colonial India. European and Indian social analysts made scientific claims about deviant female sexuality in the constitution of new fields of knowledge about social life. In the book, I make visible a complex edifice of knowledge that saw deviant female sexuality as the primary way in which to think and write about Indian society. Over the course of the book, I account for a system of modern social thought premised on the absolute exhaustive study of the subject of deviant female sexuality across genres and authorities, including philological studies that sought to find answers for the future of modern Indian society in ancient Sanskrit texts, legal sociologies in cases of trafficking in the Contagious Diseases Act and infanticide, forensic evidence of rape cases and abortion cases, ethnological theories of comparative civilizational development, and lay sociologies and women's own, supposedly, autobiographies. Multiple authorities, European, American, Indian, and in this case, largely upper-caste Hindu Bengali men, desperately and obsessively sought to detail and equate all forms of female desire with sexual deviance, and claimed the study of female sexuality as the primary explanation for the temporal lag of colonial societies. In the introduction to the book, I describe my journey in researching and writing this book, which began as a very different project. When I began the project, I had set out to do a social history of the many social classes of people who were engaged in prostitution, or what I thought would be the many types of women who were engaged in prostitution. I began to follow the archival category, prostitute, through indexes across many different kinds of archives. What I found was that the prostitute was everywhere, across a vast range of different archives from colonial India, appearing, disappearing, and then reappearing in files that seemingly had little to do with the regulation of sexual commerce. She was ubiquitous in the analysis of social life. In colonial India, the category prostitute was used to describe virtually all women outside of monogamous marriage, including the tawaif, the courtesan, the so-called dancing girl, the devadasi, high-caste Hindu widows, as well as lower caste and class Hindu and Muslim polygamous women, low-class Muslim women dock workers, indentured women forcibly transported across the British Empire, beggars, women shopkeepers, migratory laboring women who moved across the Indian Ocean in systems of labor, women following religious sects, mendicant women performers, women in the theater, urban industrial laborers, and low-caste and outcast domestic servants. So the question of the project turned from writing a history of the many types of women who I thought initially would be the social history of prostitutes, to instead ask, how could I account for the excess of this archival presence as a historical phenomenon? It seemed to me something clear that something systematic was happening, a system of thinking for which we had not yet fully accounted. To understand the haunting presence required a new practice of reading that linked together seemingly disparate archives. So in the book, I argue that at the core of the modern understanding of the prostitute is a definitional fluidity that requires a history. That is, the prostitute, when dislocated from the urge to recuperate her as an identity, as a prostitute who can be found in history, as a history of sex work and sex workers, takes on a different history, as a concept foundational to the very making of social life as an object of study. In the context of colonial India, the prostitute was trafficked as a concept that encompassed a huge range of ideas about female sexuality outside of upper caste Hindu monogamy, in the service of many things: the development of colonial social science, claims to scientific expertise, new social theories that objectified social life, making the study of society itself a seemingly natural form of knowledge. The book thus reveals how modern social theory is made possible through ideas about deviant female sexuality. It dwells in the tension between the historiographic desire of the historian of subaltern lives to recuperate marginalized subjects and assert historical presence for a presentist politics of recognition of the most marginalized people of the world, and the epistemic limits of archives where female sexuality appears in excess almost always and as an object, and yet women themselves are disappeared from view. So I see the contribution of the project as follows. First, in scholarship on South Asia and comparative colonial contexts, we have seen extraordinary studies that have foregrounded the critical place of knowledge production in the making of the modern colonial state. Indian sex life, then, reveals how at the heart of this knowledge project, the colonial knowledge project, that kind of quintessential way we think about the study of colonialism today, is the control and erasure of female sexuality, of women's desire, their will, their possibility. Modern social theory was not solely a project, however, of the colonial state, but over the course of the colonial period, a critical site for the critique of society by colonized men themselves. So over the course of the book, I use multilingual sources to account for how elite upper caste Hindu men, largely upper caste Hindu, but not always, sometimes elite Muslim men, assert a claim to progressive anti-colonial politics, paradoxically by perpetuating the idea that a colonized society was only to be liberated through the control and erasure of female sexuality. In their theories of the future of society, Indian men were the sole agents of women's freedom. By shifting focus away from solely the colonizers' understanding of sexuality, the kind of classic colonial sexuality studies, we may write histories of enduring epistemologies that reorganize sexual norms long after the formal end of colonialism. Second, the book reveals the critical place of colonial India in the making of the modern social sciences more broadly, and in particular, conceptions of Indian sexuality in the making of the comparative study of society itself in the 19th and 20th centuries as a modern object of knowledge. I demonstrate over the course of the book how Indian sexuality is a critical empirical referent. It becomes the citational apparatus, the foundational exemplar in studies for what becomes the canon of modern social theory today. As a wide range of scholars have demonstrated, the emergence of modern social thought is colonial in origins. These colonial origins, my book argues, are built on the racialized objectification and erasure of female sexuality. Third, by arguing for a concept history of the prostitute, my book complicates historical projects that have treated the heterosexual-homosexual divide, that definition, as the singular motor that drives the making of modern sexuality from the 19th century. Instead, I propose that the concept of the prostitute, and more broadly, ideas about deviant female sexuality, are critical to the reorganization of modern sexualities more broadly, foundational to normative models of what it means to be a progressive society. My study of the concept of the prostitute, then, in modern South Asia is not an additive account that globalizes already established frameworks created in Europe or in American studies with empirical evidence from South Asia. Instead, this history denaturalizes underlying assumptions about the universality of the heterosexual-homosexual divide that have long shaped practices of reading in the history of sexuality, readings that so often include deep histories of racial and colonial violence that shape modern ideas about sexuality, of the wayward girl, the fallen woman, the Jezebel, the prostitute, and the whore. This work builds then on scholarship, on a wide range of scholarship that gives me the tools to ask these anti-foundational questions and methods, from critical South Asian feminist histories, from Dalit feminisms, and scholarly interventions on sexuality and the archives, feminist and queer studies, Black feminist scholarship on writing at the limit and the possibilities and erasures of archives, queer of color critique, post-colonial thought, and subaltern studies. What kind of history might we write when we place the invention of sexuality itself as a modern concept at the colonial origins of modern social thought? How might we think anew about methods with which to write the complex history of women's sexuality? Following the insights of feminist scholarship, in particular on writing at the limits of archives, I ask readers to reflect on what Saidiya Hartman imagines as the, quote, heartbreak of cold facts about wayward women, the experience of what it means to confront these archives, to experience wonderment, the epiphany, and sometimes the profound sorrow of the objectification of women in texts that comprehensively detailed female sexual deviance over thousands and thousands of pages of descriptions, of taxonomies, of graphs, charts, and diagrams. As an experience of archival encounter, this exhaustive knowledge economy is itself exhausting. One feels depleted from page after page of violent renderings of women as abject, as stigmatized, as primitive, as dangerously untethered, outside the time of modern society. In the book, I ask readers to bear witness to the heavily circulated images of women objectified in endless case studies, to understand the narrative forms that organize women as bodies in the autopsy report or in the pedagogical medical case report, to ask about the limit of our knowledge for voiceless women subjected to forced genital examinations, to women who are put on trial and called prostitutes again and again, and to look differently at the people who appear as nameless abstractions in the ethnographic photograph and postcard. At the end of the book, I think forward from the proposition that places the control and erasure of women's sexuality at the heart of modern social theory. I return to a well-known short story written in Kolkata in 1905 by Muslim woman reformer Rokeya Sakawat Hussain in her 1905 short story Sultana's Dream. Hussein's short story is narrated by a woman, Sultana, who, while thinking about the, quote, condition of Indian womanhood, lapses into a dreamlike state and emerges with a clear vision of a distinctly alternative world she calls Ladyland. Ladyland is a place where women reign supreme in public. They innovate technologies, they foster peaceful statecraft, they kind of create a new environmentalism, while men are socially secluded in the home. The story ends when Sultana suddenly wakes up from the dream, secluded inside her own home. I thus end a book about modern social science with a curious story about a dream of Ladyland. What, if anything, do dreams have to do with modern social science? Sultana's dream is not the first dreamscape concerned with the condition of Indian womanhood that I explore in the book. Indeed, in my detailed readings of evolutionary scientific theory, I explore a very different dream, where an Indian social scientist, S.C. Mukherjee, narrates the decline and fall of high-caste Hindu society as the result of unbridled women's sexuality, in a didactic scientific text he published in 1919. In his book, he has a dream where Mother India, the figurative mother of the Indian nation, tells him to enact his patriarchal vision for a modern Hindu society free of dangerous women. In juxtaposing these dreams, one of an elite Hindu man reasserting majoritarian patriarchal control, and the other of a peaceful ladyland, I ask, why does Mukherjee's text get to claim the domain of social science, while Hussein's Ladyland is relegated to the domain of fantasy and science fiction, of speculation? What if instead we were to see the social scientific text with its copious footnotes, with its endless claims to scientific objectivity as a kind of speculative fiction? It is then that we may see how speculation governs the circular forms of reasoning where modern social theorists always turn to deviant female sexuality as explanation, where they construct copious footnotes on primitive sexual practices that fill more pages than the prose of the study itself, where they elaborate on the questionnaires that summarize Indian society through a transferable ideology of women's sexuality, where they defer to ancient text as indisputable doctrine to explain the past and future of an Indian society based in upper caste patriarchal Hindu monogamy. The civilizational logic that animates these archives, often treated as the remnant of a distant and more racially biased colonial past, instead appear in this account as the quiet foundations of modern social theories that still hold sway in present-day studies of society. It is my hope that this book may help us ask new questions about the place of sexuality and how we study and understand our modern societies, a history that I believe will help us radically reimagine who has the right to envision the future. Thank you so much. I look forward to what my esteemed colleagues have to say.
Well, it was such a pleasure to read your book. If you haven't read this already, Durba Mitra has written an exquisite, impressive, and original intellectual history. Can you hear it? Is it on? As I was saying, this is an exquisite and impressive original intellectual history that traces the making of modern social thought, as you've heard, through the investigation, study, and documentation of Indian women's sexuality through the British colonial period and beyond. In Indian Sex Life, Sexuality, and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, Mitra does not approach Indian women's sexuality as something lost or forgotten to be recovered for history, but offers us instead a history of the life of the concept, Indian women's sexuality, tracing the precise tropes and discursive regularities through which women's sexuality was constituted as an object of colonial knowledge, precisely demonstrating how it was made to appear visible and coherent in the colonial archive. She argues that the classification, legal surveillance, taxonomy, and pathology of Indian women's sexual types and practices is at the very foundation of modern science and modern social sciences, from philology, sociology, anthropology, and the study of religion to public health, medicine, and criminal law, not only in South Asia, but with consequences for the emergence of Western social sciences as well. In this way, Indian sex life employs a genealogical method which situates the object Indian sex within these discourses of philology, law, forensics, ethnology, and popular literature, demonstrating how sex came to be objectified and organized by modern social scientific thought. By genealogy, of course, we mean a project that doesn't accept as given categories and concepts as fixed and constant, but rather takes as its work the inquiry into how those categories became established as given and with what effects. It involves a curiosity about what must be made to disappear in order for the object to appear. It's a project to, in Foucault's words, desubjugate historical knowledges and to set them against the coercions of unitary formal and scientific theoretical discourse. In each chapter, then, we have an elegant detailing of the means through which a particular human science, philology, law, forensic medicine, ethnology, and popular narrative, systematically constituted and regulated Indian women's sexuality by first identifying an original ideal normative type, the upper caste woman within Hindu marriage, and then developing a taxonomy of so-called deviant practices that departed from that norm, from promiscuity, adultery, or sex work to being Muslim or of a non-Hindu sect, or simply to being an unmarried woman above the age of 15. If monogamous upper caste Hindu marriage was the mark of Indian modernity and civilization, then establishing the discipline and reform of female deviancy was the arena in which to establish the progress and the development of modern Indian society. The classifications that proliferated various types of stigmatized behaviors, from adultery and polygamy to abortion and infanticide, associated deviance with a hierarchy of caste and social differences, and also mapped such sexual traits onto an invented racial typology that included Muslims, Negroes, Semites, Aryans, and Mongolians. These practices expressed an attempt to master through social analysis, through the development of a unitary concept of the social, the identification of an origin prescribing a normative ideal, evidence of deviance from that normative ideal, and the generalization of a comparative ethnology of different peoples stemming from that evidence. The idea that the need to discipline women's sexuality and reproduction is at the heart of the structural analysis of social organization is not new. Yet, unlike thinkers who identified the traffic in women as the anchoring premise of modern social relations, from Claude Lévi-Strauss to Gail Rubin to Judith Butler, Durba Mitra specifies this premise of the woman as the index of civilization in relation to the history of colonial India. In other words, Indian sex life is an argument for the colonial origins of modern social thought. Social theory and social science and the objectification of the social world, as well as the design of methods, conventions, and categories for its analysis, she demonstrates, was born of the colonial encounter and emerged out of the need to explain, administer, and regulate the social differences of the colonized. Like Antony Anghie, who observed that colonialism and empire were not incidental to the emergence of international law, but rather that international law and the imposition of the Westphalian concept of state sovereignty were precisely developed as institutional means to manage and administer the colonial encounter, or Gauri Viswanathan, who argued that English literature did not exist before the expansion of British Empire, but was occasioned by the necessity of British education in India, and that the canon of English literature constituted as such was part of the project of impressing upon the colonized the superiority of British civilization and culture. In a resonant way, Durba Mitra argues that British colonialism in India was the condition of possibility for modern social thought, that modern social sciences were devised in order to observe and manage that colonial encounter, to objectify and systematize the study of Indian society. The development of modern social thought in Mitra's account, the invention of the object of the society to be defended, and its social reproduction by means of the repetition of both its norms and its deviations can be understood as emerging, in effect, from the need to subsume the violence of colonialism itself. The subsumption required the innovation of practices for objectifying, measuring, and classifying Indian women as a knowable object and Indian society as a field of study. In Mitra's impressive excavation and close reading of 19th century philological, sociological, and legal writings on the one hand, and medical, scientific, and ethnological works on the other, we come to understand that a vast canon of knowledge that becomes received as objective social facts about Indian women must indeed be understood as the rationalization of the violence of colonial encounter. In my own work, I've been interested in understanding a particular shift in colonial governance that takes place in the mid-19th century as Britain moved away from an older style of mercantile colonialism to an expanded empire, and from practices of territorial conquest, enslavement, and monopoly to new forms of governance linked to the production of value through the circulation of goods and people in Asia and the Americas, which is relevant to the epistemological watershed that Durba Mitra is so carefully and beautifully detailing here. Colonial mercantilism in the 18th century had been based on a zero-sum fiction in which companies like the British East India Company aimed to control production through monopolizing single industries in the colonies, such as sugar or tea, and seeking a positive balance of trade. A decrease in the profitability of colonial slavery and increase in competition for trades in the Americas, India, and China gave rise to a new economic rationality, the suggestion that trade was not finite and not zero-sum. In this context, the 1834 British abolition of slavery and the 1833 decision to end the East India Company monopoly in India and China were not only responses to liberal arguments for abolition and emancipation, but rather also measures taken to expand the British Empire by means of liberal precepts, according to this new liberal economic rationality of free trade. It signaled an economic move away from mercantilist monopoly towards global manufacture and trade, and a political decision to combine territorial rule in the East and West Indies with new forms of governance linked to commanding overseas trade through treaty ports, involving new codes and practices of classifying, racializing, and criminalizing bodies and populations. While the liberal principle of free trade claimed to lift trade barriers and break up monopoly, it was also, of course, the very means for the expansion of imperial trades and imperial dominion. The trades in opium and so-called coolies were part of this, just as the liberal rule of law provided for greater military and police right to suppress so-called unlawful social unrest and disturbances of the peace, as well as more authority for intrusive investigations into everyday social life in the colonies. Colonial laws that mandated compulsory medical exams for contagious disease and penal codes that criminalized vagrancy and prostitution expressed this new phase of liberal colonial governance. From the middle to the second half of the 19th century, the East India Company outgrew its former role as a joint stock corporation and became something more like a privately owned colonial state occupying India on behalf of the British Crown, not only responsible for revenue collection and civic administration, but elaborated as a bureaucratic agency for collecting ethnographic data about a range of social practices, pronouncing regulative norms, and surveilling, classifying, and pathologizing transgressions, and furthermore, generalizing ethnological types. So in this sense, Mitra's Indian sex life situates this shift when sex became a police matter, in Foucault's formulation, within this 19th century transformation of colonial governance. That is, when colonial philology, law, public health, and medicine became institutionalized as epistemologies for not only the investigation, but the administration of the colonial society. As Anne Laura Stoller has observed, when colonial governments begin to enumerate legitimate and illegitimate births, health, and morbidity, and to develop taxonomies that divide normative from deviant behaviors, the policing of sex was less a negative power of enforcing a taboo and more a productive power of governing population as the ordered maximization of collective and individual forces. Mitra's studies details the modes of governance for exposing these hidden truths of Indian sex life, whether forced genital examinations to discover sexual secrets or police investigations to uncover the intimate details of sex, or forensic collections of private specimens or testimonies and confessions that reveal the inner life of the fallen woman for popular consumption. These colonial discourses that codified social difference and marked the boundaries of society by focusing on bodies and practices that ostensibly transgress those boundaries may have been less aimed at the curtailment or suppression of sexual deviance and more at governing the gendered caste social order itself. Mitra observes the definitional fluidity of the term prostitute, as she's just been speaking, for example, that comprised a wide array of people from sex workers, courtesans, dancing girls and actresses, mistresses and temporary wives, Brahmin widows, Muslim women, and women from non-Hindu sects. The social, medical, legal, and ethnological discourses around the prostitute were, and continue to be, vehicles for regulating social inclusion and exclusion, health and morbidity, caste hierarchy, widowhood and inheritance, labor and religion. In a way, female deviance is the limit against which the normative social order was established, and its repetitive regulation across all social domains becomes the means through which the social order is reproduced and maintained. Embedding the history of modern social thought in the colonial encounter does not imply that modern social analysis involved anything like a one-way imposition of colonial classifications upon a passive colonized. Rather, the emergence of modern social and human sciences mediated the entanglements of lived colonial social relations and represented the desire to rationalize these relations of contact and encounter in a linear narrative of development from savagery to civilization. Mitra portrays the documentation, the medicalization, the legal surveillance, and narrative representations of normative and deviant categories of women as mutually constituted and adopted by Bengali philologists, doctors, and social evolutionists who generalized them into a system that undergirded Indian society. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Indian nationalist elites sought to define themselves as a group at once distinct from British colonizers and the indigenous lower orders. As Partha Chatterjee, Lata Mani, Kumkum Sangari, and Sudesh Farid and others have observed, nationalist discourses on the woman question often re-articulated colonial categories, converging especially around the definition of proper womanhood that restated hierarchies of caste, class, status, religion, and social order. Each of the chapters details collaborations between British Indologists, jurists, and colonial administrators and evolutionists on the one hand, and upper caste Bengali philologists, doctors, social scientists, and nationalist intelligentsia on the other, detailing and riveting in often chilling ways their convergence and collaboration around the condemnation and discipline of Indian female deviance as this primitive element to be overcome by the progress of nationalist modernity. I wish to end my remarks by simply expressing pure admiration for the immense amount of archival research and the outstanding quality of the conceptual analysis and original thinking that's gone into the writing of Indian sex life. It's truly an extraordinary accomplishment, a work poised to make profound interventions into not only South Asian studies and women's gender and sexuality studies, but into critical social theory, intellectual history, and the sociology of knowledge. It's beautifully written, and the organization of the book is particularly artful, with chapters not only investigating the discrete disciplines of philology, law, forensic medicine, ethnology, and narrative, but each chapter also identifies and elaborates a particular analytical move that's characteristic of modern social science methods: the identification of origins, the use of repetition and circular argument, reliance on development and evolution, and the positivist insistence on truth and veracity. I hope that in our discussion following, we'll be able to speak more specifically about the continuing legacy of these social science methods built upon the colonial abjection of women's sexuality and the critical questions that this raises for knowledge production today. Thank you.
I'm honored to be here in such great company talking about a wonderful and inspiring book. Durba Mitra's formidably erudite Indian sex life argues, as you have heard, that the idea of the prostitute helped to found modern Indian thinking about society. Projects as diverse as sexology, the philological study of ancient texts, anthropological speculation about the evolution of kinship forms, the creation of new legal codes, the empirical data collection associated with surveys and censuses, and the first-person testimonies associated with autobiographies and accounts of city life all converged on the figure of the prostitute, defined as any woman who was sexually active outside of monogamous marriage to a man. Indeed, the definition of the prostitute Mitra shows was even more expansive than this, and the definition of the kind of marriage that could make a woman safe for society even more limited. Only women who married within their class, caste, religion, or ethnicity were immune from being classified as prostitutes by men who wielded power. As someone who specializes in 19th century England and France, I am primed to notice several thought-provoking differences and similarities between Mitra's arguments about India and the arguments made in foundational studies of England and France during roughly the same historical period. That is to say, I am primed to ask some comparative questions. Because Mitra's book is, among other things, a powerful condemnation of comparative modes of thinking that establish equivalences and correlations and translate difference into sameness, it's important to underscore that my comparative questions do not presume or seek to establish similarity. Instead, I want to use comparison to highlight specificity rather than efface it. But I'm also interested in how Mitra's study of India can generate some new research questions for thinking about similar issues in France and England by helping us to provincialize Europe as its own special case, and by asking us to think about how a colony can influence how we think about the metropole rather than assuming that power, ideas, and paradigms flow only from metropoles to colonies. So the first big comparative question I have, and you talked about this in talking about the genesis of the project, is that almost none of the Indian discourses that Mitra analyzes seem to focus on prostitution as a financial transaction. And that is, in large part, what enabled Indian thinkers to label almost any woman a prostitute. Prostitution in Indian social thought extends well beyond the sale of sex. Labeling as deviant and criminal any woman who had sex outside monogamous marriage, even if no money changed hands. Now, by contrast, the foundational scholarship on 19th century French and British discourses of prostitution by Judith Walkowitz, Elena Corbin, Charles Bernheimer, Amanda Anderson, Victoria Thompson, and others always focuses on prostitution as the exchange of sex for money. Because British and French doctors, police, urban chroniclers, and nascent sociologists equated prostitution with a financial transaction and its transgression with the commodification of sex rather than just with female sexual autonomy, those sociologists and urban chroniclers, doctors, and police also tended to associate prostitution with crime and poverty, or in more progressive accounts with exploited labor and class conflict. So in his Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Karl Marx wrote that prostitution is only a specific expression of the general prostitution of the laborer. And Marx could use the prostitute as a metaphor for the exploited worker because both were subject to dehumanizing commodification by being forced to sell their bodies and to make something that should never be made equivalent to money, reducible to money. So this leads me to my first question, which is, were there circumstances in which the researchers, doctors, jurists, novelists, and policymakers at the center of Indian sex life highlighted prostitution as a monetary transaction, or did it really never come up at all? My comparative observation, however, also generates questions for scholars of England and France. You know who you are, one of them, which is, was the definition of prostitution really as delimited as the scholarship on it has made it out to be? And there's a sense in which certainly studies of England have always suggested not, because there's also this concept of the fallen woman in England that was much more broad than simply the sale of sex for money, and you mentioned the fallen woman, and that was a category that referred to any woman who had sex outside of marriage. But it did not, the fallen woman was not subject to the same kind of legal and medical policing as the prostitute. And so that's an important difference. And so there was this broadly capacious category, but the capaciousness almost protected the women who were designated fallen. So if the question is, was the definition of prostitution in England and France really limited to commodification and the exchange of sex for cash, I would say that Mitra's study helps me to see that the answer is probably no. It is probably not accurate to say that the British and French only defined prostitutes as women who exchanged sex for money. At the very least, we should correct this definition to say that the British and French defined prostitutes as women who exchanged sex for money outside the framework of monogamous marriage. Since many legally married English and French women receive financial support from their husbands in exchange for sex, but only a few radical feminists ever proposed that this made wives prostitutes. And this in turn suggests that in England and France, the question of prostitution was as closely connected to the containment of female sexual desire and agency as it was in India, which is in some ways the argument that Amanda Anderson makes about prostitution in Victorian England, arguing that it was that everybody was so exercised about the prostitute because the prostitute was a figure for the loss of agency in general. Nonetheless, when she looks at examples, her examples are focused on women who exchange sex for money. A French or British woman was saved from being classified as a prostitute not by separating her sexual activity from money, but by becoming the exclusive sexual partner of a husband who had far more freedom and agency than his wife. In other words, I think that the definition at work in Indian sex life really does apply to the French and British case, and then the interesting question becomes, why did nobody ever notice that? So, of course, we're all familiar with this phenomenon, I think, because in colloquial usage, for centuries, and to this day, the French and English languages both have a very frequent tendency to designate any woman who does not confine her sexual activity to her husband or to a single man as a whore or a slut, even if no money is changing hands when that woman commits adultery or has premarital sex or has multiple sexual partners. As in India, prostitution in England and in France was closely tied to questions of reputation, virtue, and honor. And although studies of prostitution in France and England have certainly focused on some of these issues, Charles Bernheimer's book about prostitution in France, for example, is called Figures of Ill Repute. They have still done so by homing in quite narrowly on narratives involving financial exchanges. Now, this made sense in terms of a research program. Given how many women in England and France did sell sex at some point in their lives, it was daunting enough to try to learn about all the women defined as prostitutes in the narrowest sense of the term. But Mitra's studies suggest that if we really want to understand what prostitution meant in the metropole, we need to acknowledge that the term was much more plastic and capacious than the foundational scholarship's focus on women trading sex for money has acknowledged. This leads me to a second comparative observation, one having to do with the temporality of prostitution as a concept. Mitra shows that a set of anti-colonial thinkers intent on modernizing India often associated the prostitute with ancient times. The prostitute was a primitive artifact or holdover in their accounts, linked to, quote, the problem of tradition in Indian society. As Mitra writes, unrestrained female sexuality, named as the prostitute, was conceived of as primitive, both lag and lack. Primitive, earliest in temporal development, from a time before men got control of us. Understood to be a woman who acted solely through sexual instinct. Lag, characterized as temporally out of sync with modern institutions and their attendant individual comportment. And lack, deficient of the very means of conscious restraint necessary for social and sexual development. This is strikingly different from French and British discourses, which tended to see prostitution as a distinctively modern problem, if not, in some cases, a metaphor for modernity. As Mitra powerfully shows at the opening of Indian Sex Life, the truism of prostitution as the world's oldest profession, which might seem to contradict the notion of prostitution as a modern problem, was in fact a phrase coined by Rudyard Kipling to talk about India. In France and England, by contrast, prostitution was almost exclusively associated with modernity's reduction of everything to the cash nexus, and with capitalism's and urbanization's erosion of stable traditional social forms. So prostitution wasn't a holdover from tradition. Prostitution was a sign that tradition was coming apart. So here again, I think that Mitra's work offers new research questions for those who work on the 19th century metropole that exported so many of its social ills to the places it colonized. Social ills that included the Contagious Diseases Act, which forced women to undergo gynecological examinations against their wills, as well as the police brutality enabled to this day by laws that asymmetrically criminalize the sale of sex more than its purchase. And these questions also have to do with the longue durée. Mitra asks why Indian social thinkers were so intent on seeing prostitution as an ancient problem. This should inspire scholars of Europe to ask why, given that prostitution existed in Europe for many centuries and was clearly not created by modernity, so many 19th century French and British thinkers felt compelled to define prostitution as quintessentially modern. What prevented the British and French from analyzing prostitution as a long-standing phenomenon? And my final question has to do with the relationship between what we might call forces on the one hand and forms on the other. The key social forces that Mitra analyzes are power relations between, and often power relations that leverage some kind of difference. So power relations between men and women, between religions, primarily Hindu and Muslim, between castes, and between colonizer and colonized. Interestingly, in the latter cases, and here I think I have a slightly different reading from you, Mitra finds a surprising lack of difference. Upper caste women were as vulnerable to being labeled prostitutes as lower caste women. Indian anti-colonial nationalists and British representatives of the imperial state found much common ground in their drive to label and stigmatize as deviant women who had sex outside marriage. Now, one of the major achievements of Indian social life is to show how these social forces extended their reach through certain forms of thought, typology, empiricism, description, surveys. All of these forms equated the categories that they invented, such as the prostitute, with fact, claiming to have discovered a reality they were, in fact, fabricating. Mitra shows that Indian social thought about prostitution thus reduced diversity to uniformity, translating and reducing, and here I'm repeating the categories you've heard already, courtesans, dancers, actresses, vagrants, high caste widows, polygamous wives, sailors' wives, women in religious sects, industrial workers, and domestic servants into a single type, the prostitute, and then violently imposing that type on real women. So one of the powerful features of Indian sex life as a work of scholarship is Mitra's willingness to take a strong stand against reductive forms of social thought. This is a book with culprits, and the culprit is not the prostitute, who Mitra effectively shows did not even exist, at least not as defined by the social thinkers she studies. Nor is it the prostitute's clients, who make only rare appearances here, and I'm curious to hear more about them, along with monetary transactions that seem to be absent from the archive. But the culprits here are also misogyny as a social force, as well as description as a form of social thought. So I want to end by asking whether empirical forms of social thought are as irredeemably oppressive as the social forces to which they were giving expression. As Heather Love's recent work on inductive observational forms of sociology in the mid-20th century United States suggests, there is also a tradition of progressive empirical research that does not enforce notions of deviance, but actively sets out to undo them. Is it possible to imagine a feminist project of describing female sexuality that would not be compromised by the very operation of description? I'm not suggesting that anything in this book was that project, of course. And on the other hand, how much causal power, as opposed to maybe circumstantial power, should be assigned to forms of thought such as taxonomies and surveys? Is it possible that the culprit is simply misogyny in whatever form it takes?
Thank you.
Where's Sunil?
Yeah, we're like, where's Sunil? Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Lisa and Sharon, for these extraordinary, thank you so much for reading the book. I think the funny thing about finishing a book is then you experience what a reader perceives of the book, which is often different than what you might have imagined for the book. So it has a life which is different. And thank you for reading and telling me about the life it had when you read it. Thank you also for these questions. And I think I could respond to some of the questions. I think particularly the question of sexual commerce I will respond to. And then we could open it up as well. The first thing I wanted to say was, I think at the beginning of my book, I describe how Rudyard Kipling, in a short story on the city wall, uses the phrase, the world's most ancient profession. And that's actually where the idea of the oldest profession comes from, is this short story written about a so-called courtesan, a prostitute, which he basically equates. He doesn't name her as a prostitute in the story. And in his description, he begins by talking about the world's most ancient profession. And he differentiates the us and them of that ancient profession. And he says, in England, essentially, we talk a lot there's lots of social discourses about morality, about prostitution, but what we've learned is that it's a very modern form. In India, it's a hereditary form, and that's why it's the most ancient profession. And so that differentiation, and in some ways, Sharon, I think you pointed this out right away, is that in some ways there is a hyper-modernity to the idea of it in the sociologies of prostitution for the 19th century, for France and England, in a way that it functions simultaneously as a racialized pre-modernity for every other place that term travels in some ways. So I think that idea functions multiply. I think what we would find if we were to look at racialized sexualities, probably, although of course I haven't done this empirical research, in France, in early 20th century Paris, is that maybe those questions of primitivity might come back in ways that we may not imagine. And certainly for the travel of racialized bodies or racialized women moving in imperial spaces, British imperial spaces. So even if the prostitute is the marker of the most dangerous part of urban social life and modernity in England, there is no such thing as an England that is hyper-modern. At the same time, the prostitute is established as outside of modernity entirely for all of the rest of the empire. And so I think that those things are twinned and doing work together, if that makes sense, to create a pre-modernity to the hypersexuality of everywhere else in the world, and to say that the sexuality that is here in England and France is one that can be eradicated. So whereas it's natural in the colonial space, it has a way of being denaturalized that's what I would suspect. And when I think about it, Ruth Karas's work, who's a medievalist of England, her work shows that the word prostitute in medieval England meant many forms of female sexuality outside of marriage. That actually in the 19th century in England, it becomes delimited to mean the idea of sexual commerce in a way, legally, and also then in social discourse, in a way that wasn't always the case, as you said. And so there's a way to think about the prehistory of the prostitute as one of perceived pre-modern forms. And so there's some work being done, I would say, in the hyper-attention to the sex transaction as a 19th century discourse about Europe, which has disappeared in the colonial context. That's not to say that some of the texts that I talk about they do talk about transaction, but in some ways they don't in the way one would imagine. Like if you look at a 19th century text from England talking about prostitution, they talk a lot about the transfer of money or the fact that women hold money. In the context of the text that I look at, especially in the last chapter, which are literary texts from the early 20th century, written in Bengali, there's one text that I talk about, Ratar Kolkata, or the idea of Calcutta at night, from 1923, and that text describes lots of these body bodacious women on the street, and they have lots of jewelry. And so there are designations or ideas about their wealth, but the idea of transaction itself is not the moral danger in the narrative form, from what I would say. And so I think there is something about sex as commodified in the context of the metropole, which is specific and which allows for the possibility of reform where sex would no longer be commodified because of marriage. And in this context, there's almost an impossibility of the outside of what a prostitute is. Mm-hmm. So whereas one allows the possibility of the outside, that there is a redeemable woman, here there's no redemption for the prostitute in some ways. The other thing I would say in terms of the question of comparison is that one of the things that, whether it's the hypermodern prostitute of 19th century and early 20th century America and Europe, or the thoroughly unmodern prostitute of 19th century India and many of the colonies, the interesting thing for me is that the prostitute itself is an object, meaning one is hypersexual. One is hyper commoditized, one is not. But one of the things that we've spoken about a lot is the fact that she is the kind of primary object of a whole range of modern sociologies in the 19th century. In fact, the study of modern life, modern urban life itself, and of course I'm going to slaughter this because Annabelle and Hannah know this, Perron du Châtelet, thank you so much, that if we look at studies of the unruly woman in the 1920s in Chicago, you see this inside the Harriman citations, right, of whether it's the Philadelphia Negro or otherwise, that the field of sociology studied the prostitute. That the prostitute is this foundational category. The wayward woman is the foundational subject of the idea of sociological knowledge itself. And so I think there's a really important argument to be made about that, that the discipline of sociology itself emerges in the objectification of female sexuality. And that, I think, is where the comparative may be another way to think about across these spaces. And I have many, many other things that I could say about mercantilism, but but I don't want to dominate this thing. So thank you so much. I think we can open it, and I'm going to give Sunil power.
And one point that you raised, Lisa, which I would love to hear you
please
come back to, was the idea of saying a little bit more about the much longer legacies of this moment that we're talking about. And I wondered if you wanted to weigh in, Lisa, about the elements that struck you that you'd like to talk about in terms of these kind of enduring legacies of this colonial moment that Durba is writing about.
Mm-hmm. Well, please, go ahead.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you are specifically asking about.
And the one that your
what I ended with?
Was
okay.
You wanted to talk more
yes,
about that.
Yes. No, what strikes me, and I said this in my remarks, is how much I'm struck by what you're saying about Saidiya Hartman's book and the chapter on Du Bois and the investigation of Black women's sexuality being a kind of parallel. But at the same time, and particular to American sociology, but I think you're making a really ambitious claim about the origin of modern social thought in colonial encounter that, that is comparable to something like Anthony Angi's work on international law. So I guess my question is, it's similar to Sharon's in a way. In Sharon's question of, is there a form of empirical social science that is not this? And I guess I would ask it this way, which is that what is the legacy of this tradition of social thought? How do we tease from it other manners of thinking that are not collaborating with this rationalizing subsumption of colonial violence. And, how do we think about the social now? I mean, those are really big questions, and of course, you've just written this amazing book. So,
Right.
But it might be something that people have ideas about.
Right.
I understood, particularly the organization of the book, which I thought was really beautiful. I understood you as delineating particular kinds of operations, mechanisms, tropes, regulative functions that social sciences default to. And so the question I think that Sharon is asking is this a formal matter, or is it a matter of historical, social power and violence?
Right. I mean, and
so I'm sort of going on that
right.
side.
And I think, so is there a form of social science that is not misogynist social science? Is there, hello social scientists in the room, I am also a social scientist, but also is there a version, meaning is it the method as you describe, is it the form, is there a method that uses or reimagines these forms, whether it's the taxonomy, the forms of description, that could be generative in a very different way than the social scientists certainly that I'm looking at.
I mean, if I can just break in just to say, it's a humanities issue too, right?
Absolutely.
It's a question that people, it's tended to be asked more about our humanities
representation
objects than about humanistic forms of study. But the problem of the gaze, is there any way to create a film that shows women on the screen that isn't going to somehow repeat the violence of the male gaze?
Right.
Is there any narrative that isn't going to end up binding and containing women's energies? I mean, these are long-standing arguments in the humanities as well.
Right, right. No, absolutely.
It's our problem.
Right, it's our problem, right? But I think the reason that we're saying it's our problem as a presentist concern is that, and this is, I think, why I cited Saidiya Harriman, and particularly, is that I think the idea that it is a problem that one should be cognizant of as a problem is, I think, the point that I want to make, rather than the fact that it is a problem and so therefore these methods must be dismissed of completely, but rather that we focus a lot on the question of methods, but we are not asking, that often, at least in the hard social sciences, I find, that the questions that generate the data forms are often not what we're taught to think about. Mm-hmm. So you take a methods class in the hard social sciences, and it's not a methods class that says how do you ask a question. It's a whole set of things of how do you conduct a survey, and so the question of what a survey is supposed to do, the history of where the survey is generated from, that's what I find interesting. And yes, I think you mentioned Heather Love's work, which is deeply informative, I think, of the work here, and many of the reasons why I focus on the question of description in the book, because Heather is taking a mid-century, 20th century moment where deviancy had already been defined as a kind of object for social science, Durkheim, post-Durkheim, and early Chicago school, where it was an object to be disappeared because of sociology. And then there's a set of sociologists who are in some ways responding to that, to say that deviancy should be studied as an object itself, but not in order to disappear deviancy. And so I think in some ways it ends up being teleological. My next project is looking at women who take up the project of social science in the middle of the 20th century. Indian feminists who take up the project of social science, and what does that project taking it up do? What kind of questions can they ask with the same practices of empiricism and with the same urge for description and the same urge for taxonomies? I think that the answer is actually quite varied, because some of what I say at the beginning of the book is that there is a way in which the social sciences, when it's taken up by the Indian elites as a project of anti-colonialism, actually is about the obfuscation of caste and about the obfuscation of Muslim difference, meaning it creates a kind of Hinduized society that actually uses the language of social science to not name casteist practice. Mm-hmm. So social science becomes a way of obscuring social hierarchy under the language of science. That is very much, in some ways, what I see happens in the mid-20th century among Indian feminists. So even when there is an object, even when they claim to be arguing for gender as a category, and this is again what becomes policy, the idea of the creation of the Status of Women report and so on, that some of these problems that are embedded within the methods sometimes reproduce themselves. And so I don't think it's an either or, if that makes sense. It's to say that our methods are never neutral, which I think all of us know, but to say that their neutrality sits in a different location than we might imagine, or the politics of it sits in a different location than we might imagine.
I have another question that didn't factor in my comments, but I was wondering. So, we spent a lot of time thinking about the prostitute, but there's so much literature on widows, for example, and who are associated with impurity, and because they can't remarry instantly, are culprits who have abortions and so forth. I'm just wondering if in the exercise of finding a unitary object, we may also be obfuscating the ways in which there are different genealogies of containment.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you think about that. And then the one that struck me especially was homosexuality or queer practices generally, whether or not they could be included in the same category or the same genealogy as the deviant woman. And I wonder if there's a way in which, for the sake of tracing this unitary object, are we conflating a lot of things? I don't know what you think about that.
So I think I'll start with homosexuality. I think homosexuality is an interesting question. I mean, in some ways, there is an emphasis, and I said this in my comments as well, that the distinction between heterosexuality and homosexuality as the defining feature for how we understand modern sexuality may not be the best way to organize how we think about modern sexuality in the context of colonial India and many colonial spaces, indeed. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an incitement to discourse, to use Foucault's language, about homosexuality. But in some ways, part of what, if you were to look across archives, or certainly the archives that I look at, there is very little discussion about homosexuality relative to how much discussion there is about ideas of the control or the problem of the excess of female sexuality. And so I see these things as related, meaning that the discourses about homophobia that then emerge in the 20th century use the same language as a resource of the monogamous marriage and heterosexuality, that in some ways that the excess of female sexuality is a way of naturalizing one form of heterosexuality, reproductive heterosexuality, that is about the marginalization of every other form of sexuality. And so it's not to say that there isn't an incitement, but I think what you're saying is correct, is that does it conflate it? Perhaps, but that's the project of genealogy sometimes, is that in order to trace one figure, you have to say that there are these other secondary figures in the project. But I actually think in the case, at least, and then again, this is why I think I went very deeply empirical in the chapters, is to say, based in these specific archives, there's actually virtually no discussion of homosexuality relative to something like the prostitute. The widow gets to be, or rather the prostitute gets to encompass the widow, but as you say, is that the widow has its own genealogy, which is critically important. I think the reason that the widow becomes an object of knowledge is, to use the language of B.R. Ambedkar in an essay that he wrote in 1916, she is part of a problem of the surplus woman. That is to say that she's part of a sociological problem of the woman who doesn't sit within the domain of monogamous marriage. And so I agree with you, absolutely. But I think there has been some work on the genealogy of the widow as an idea, and as a modern idea, and that's very much Let the Money. And I see myself in that tradition, meaning every chapter I begin thinking with foundational thinkers, whether it's Let the Money or Barney Cohn, who have set the ground for which I can ask a set of questions about knowledge. So it's to say that in these genealogies, we can find one genealogy and we can tell the story of a genealogy that is largely seen as natural, that we haven't thought of this as actually something that there's something productive happening here.
Can I just ask a quick question? It goes back to the other thing that struck me as notably absent, but it's fairly typical of discussions of prostitution, a lack of emphasis on the male clients. But to the extent that what you're showing is that this is about the discourse of naturalizing heterosexual monogamous marriage, was there just an understanding that it was monogamy for women only? I mean, that's what Engels says in the Argents and he's like, well, there's monogamy supposedly in among the European bourgeoisie, but it's only monogamy for the women. And was that sort of a tacit?
It is.
Yeah.
And okay.
But if you notice that in the last chapter, which is about veracity, the idea of the fact, I look in particular at Hindu polygamy, upper caste Hindu polygamy, which is a critique of Hindu men who participate in having hundreds of wives, essentially. So, and at the end of those discourses, they describe that the Hindu polygamous man, the Kulin Brahmin, as a prostitute. So because he uses his wives in order to get dowries, essentially. So it's a transactional account. And so the critique that is made of a woman, and so of course his wives in that discourse, his wives are perceived as prostitutes, that he marries multiple women, he exchanges money in the process of marriage, and then he doesn't keep them in his own home. So there's no surveillance of their sexuality. They become possibly prostitutes, and then that's where the cases of abortion come in. And he is prostituting himself. And so the language of the prostitute becomes a way to critique men who also participate in structures outside of monogamous marriage. And it's, in fact, a kind of upwardly mobile elite that are not the highest high caste. So lower caste, high caste people are making a critique of the highest caste who is participating in polygamy. So they're making a critique of what is called hypergamy. So there's all of these caste movements that are happening, or critiques that are happening, by making claims to monogamy as the natural form.
Should we open it up and get
Yes.
some more voices into the conversation? Wave if I can't see you at the back.
Your fan, Kelvin.
Hi, I'm Kelvin. I'm a PhD student in history at Yale. I thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. I really, really enjoyed reading your book. I have two questions, one that's more methodological and one that's more substantive. My more methodological question has to do with the sort of anti-foundationalist approach that you take in your monograph, and thinking about how we might use that to think about the conceptual labor that's being done by the label deviant female sexuality. I'm really interested in this question because just thinking of Judith Butler's theory of the performative is that nominalism is precisely that which endows gender with positive meaning, and Horton Spiller's argument that the endowment of gender with positive meaning was precisely based on the degendering of black people during the Middle Passage. So I'm really interested in how we might use your work to think about the category of female itself, and how the deployment of deviant female sexuality, what that does to how we might think of femaleness and like gender as categories endowed with positive value. My second question that's more substantive would have to do with 1857 and thinking about how we might use that to think whether or not 1857 is a moment of like continuity or rupture. Thinking about like 1857 as a moment of reorganization of political economy, and how conceptions of a prostitute may or may not shift before and after.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kelvin.
Theoretical and historical.
Yeah, theoretical and historical. And easy questions.
Kelvin is everyone's ideal student.
Absolutely, without question. And has actually written an extraordinary way of thinking forward, a brilliant way of thinking forward based on this book. So thank you for that, Kelvin. The first question is methodological, about this question of female. In the introduction, I had a writerly problem, which is that if I am saying that the prostitute is a category, is a concept, and I am no longer calling the historical subject a prostitute, what as a writer am I supposed to do to describe the subjects that I am telling a history about. And so over the course of many, many moons, I was trying to figure out the phrase, the terms, the ways I would describe this idea. And eventually, I settled on deviant female sexuality. And in the introduction, I describe deviant, in particular, as an object because I'm interested in the emergence of deviance and deviancy itself as a subject of sociological study in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I have a little footnote there on female because I didn't know how to deal with this grammatical issue, which is that deviant women's sexuality, deviant modifies women, and I'm not really meaning to modify women, and so then I end up with deviant female sexuality because I wanted everything to modify sexuality. And I was trying to decide whether or not I was going to gender the category. And what I realized is I really wanted to gender. I used the word female on purpose, as you're describing, to create a positive value, because I think that there is a dual project here in the constitution of sexual difference as central to the colonial project, and so sexual difference and sexuality are twinned or intertwined projects that are coming together in the late 18th century. And so in thinking about gender, the other thing I would say is that there's now some recent very excellent historical projects on the Hijra, the so-called emergence of the Hijra in the late 19th century, who are also gendered female, meaning that there is virtually an absence of discussion of female to male or any, female to male, what would we would today describe as anyone who would be perceived as a trans or transgendered individuals. There's no legal regulation of it. However, there's lots of legal regulation of people who are perceived as male-bodied, who are then perceived as performing female forms or female social identities. And so I purposely used female to say that I actually think that this is the word prostitute is actually used sometimes to describe hijras or so-called hijras or eunuchs is used to describe those categories as well in the 19th century. So it's doing that double work. The other thing I would say is more recently I was writing an essay for a keywords project in gender and sexuality studies, which never sign up to write a keyword. It's really difficult. Obviously, see book, have not answered the question. But in this case, I was supposed to write an essay about the keyword sexuality. And so easy, so easy. But etymologically, the English word sexuality only emerges in the 1780s. And it emerges in natural science textbooks, perhaps unsurprisingly. And it also emerges in 1780s in William Jones, who is a kind of key philologist who founds the Asiatic Society in Calcutta because he's learning Sanskrit. And he's learning Sanskrit by translating, or he calls them translating these Sanskrit poems. And he has one poem it's a very long poem, in 247 verses, about Draupadi and all of these so-called typographical figures from the Mahabharata. And in there, he uses natural scientific terms to describe the fact that Indian women also often have multiple husbands or have sex with multiple men. So deviant female sexuality is actually critical to the beginning of his translation project. And there he describes this woman as a Linnaean type. He describes her as, the polyandrian monogyna, or monogyny. I can't believe I'm forgetting the Latin there. My Latin teacher would be very upset with me. But to say that, in fact, he's using natural science, and as the natural sciences themselves, to produce sexual difference as a natural form in the description of Indian womanhood. And so to kind of answer, thinking about gendering as a positive value, I think the constitution of Indian womanhood as an object of knowledge is happening as gendering is happening itself, as sexual difference is being enacted as a system of knowledge. The second question about rebellion and the historical question of political economy is that you can find traces of the category prostitute before it's used in the East India Company's kind of informal legal forms in the 1810s, and it's passed by Macaulay as part of the Penal Code in the 1830s, or it's written in the Penal Code in the 1830s, but it's only passed after 1857 as the Indian Penal Code. So it's actually the Indian Penal Code written in the 1830s, which is the first use of the category prostitute in that. But it's enforced as a subject of law only after the rebellion, because rebellion creates the possibility just that there's a shift there, which is, I think, what Lisa was pointing out, of the types of knowledge that's necessary for colonial rule after 1857.
Thank you so much, Durba, for writing your book. And thank you to Lisa Lowe and Sharon Marcus for your wonderful comments. I got really excited when you started talking about etymology. If you know me, you'll know I'm a nerd for etymology, and I also don't believe in translation. So I have a question for you about the adventure of the word prostitute, because in listening to the comments tonight, I don't know why it never occurred to me, like, when the idea of the prostitute became divorced from the idea of money, when, like, Greek and Latin words for prostitute are very transactional, porne for selling and meretrix for earning, and then you jump a couple, like, 1,600 years to the idea of the public woman prostitute. I think it's pro statuere, to place yourself in front of. So I was wondering what the kind of autochthonous languages of India used to refer to what gets called the prostitute, and if there's a marked difference after the fact of the colonial encounter, where a British notion of prostitute, of the public woman, kind of makes its mark on native languages. Mm-hmm. So, what happens to the language in the colonial encounter as well?
Mm-hmm. This book is based in Bengali, like I work in Bengali language, which, because Calcutta was the seat of the empire, there's lots of reasons it's important in terms of thinking about the history of social science. However, it's one of many, many, many languages. However, I think you would find that, one of the things that I did when I first started doing archival research and had the suspicion about the multiplicity of this idea is I started to write down every word I could find that came to mean prostitute by the early 20th century. And I found probably more than 260 that would, if you were to look at a dictionary, and of course the dictionaries that are being produced are part of the Colonial translation project, meaning they're being produced in order to help colonial subjects learn English or help administrators learn the local language. And so that by the time you're looking at late 19th century dictionaries, there's a whole range of terms that come to mean the prostitute. In the fourth chapter, I look at the way that there is a project of equivalence that allows the possibility of a whole range of terms, largely from Sanskrit, and then that come into the so-called vernacular languages, in this case Bengali, that then gets translated as prostitute. One term in particular in that chapter is a term gonika, which is, in Sanskrit, it would be a courtly woman, a woman in a courtly society, but it certainly, if you were to look at it, the reason I'm challenged to even translate it is today a Sanskrit scholar would also translate it, or has often translated it as prostitute. So this is an epistemological circle that it becomes very difficult, but this is a woman of high status, largely in certain Sanskrit texts, especially when it's being used in the 19th century. If you look at the book that I look at, which uses the word gonika is like a woman who has relations with many, or as you said, a woman who's placed in front of, right? In this way, in front of many. And so if you look at the literal translation, you get a sense of sexual promiscuity. If you look at the translation of it in Sanskrit text, I think some scholars of Sanskrit would say there's multiple ways to think about this, but you wouldn't necessarily equate it with the prostitute, or certainly not a low-class prostitute. It's not a transactional form. And then in the text that I look at, which is a social science text, a kind of text on evolution, there it very much means the low caste prostitute. And so by the end of the 19th century, using gonika becomes the kind of easy term. But I look at a whole range of terms, and they mean public woman. It's a public woman, a woman who's on the outside, a woman who's outside of clan, who's outside of caste. they use terms that are incorporated from Persian, that are incorporated from other languages. And one of the things that I find when I present the book in context or with scholars of South Asia is that people who work on Urdu or other South Asian languages will say, yes, that actually happens in our language group as well. This whole range of categories by the early 20th century are perceived as prostitute or translated as prostitute. So if you read modern translations, you will see modern translators often call women prostitutes. You see it over and over again, kind of salacious stories of this prostitute's autobiography, which if you look at the text there, you could read it much more ambiguously, but it's read that way. I feel like I'll just have a question, yeah.
This was amazing. It was such a great conversation. I was struck by this, well, the kind of, the sequence of remarks, and especially the interesting sort of contrast between, I'm not sure it's a contrast, but Lisa sort of foregrounding the colonial origins of a female deviant sexuality as foundational to modern social thought, and Sharon Marcus talking about the interesting differences, right, between the definitional fluidity of the prostitute in the colonial context versus the definitional circumscription of the prostitute when it comes to Europe, when it comes to France and Britain. So I just wanted to go back to that. And your response to this was to say that that these were of a piece, right? That the kind of fluidity on the one side, or the capaciousness of the concept, right, on the one side, and its circumscription on the other, was precisely the point, right? That that distinction points not just to the making of modern social science or modern social theory, but to the foundational role of the East-West distinction, right, in the production of modern social theory. So I wonder if you could say something more about that, whether that's also part of the analysis in your book, that you're seeing the emergence of a distinction between colony and metropole at the same time that deviant female sexuality is becoming foundational to social science writ large. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think, you emphasize the question of distinction. And I think that that's certainly the case. I mean, that's the kind of epistemology. Again, I stand on the foundations of huge numbers of scholars who have made these kinds of arguments about that moment that distinction can be made. So again, when I talk about William Jones, of course, that moment is a moment to create a distinction. The reason he uses Linnaeus to describe Indian sexuality is that it can be natural, it's not human, right? So human sexuality is to be differentiated from the Linnaean forms of natural sexualities that are found in Indian ancient texts. I think that there is something else that I find happening, or at least that is a query for me, which is about the fact that gender and sexuality become the way to create a distinction, but it also becomes a way of creating a knowledge citational project, meaning that colony and metropole are being created, absolutely, but actually metropole creates an entire citational apparatus based in colony. And so Kelvin says this at the beginning of his remarks as well, which is that Levi-Strauss in the 1950s, if you look at the footnotes of Levi-Strauss and of course who he's standing on, Lewis Henry Morgan, and of course all of those ethnologists, that their citations are entirely based in these ethnological studies and ethnographic studies of contexts like India. And so what their abstractions obviously are based in that empirical study. And Levi-Strauss's are based on all of these key ethnographic studies of Hindu society that allows him to make arguments about the difference between exogamy and endogamy and so on. that East-West distinction is in some ways made and actually made in a moment of intermingling, meaning the reason I'm interested in modern social thought is that it's made as a false distinction because what's actually happening is modern social theory is creating the East or whatever as its citational apparatus to create abstraction. So I actually think that the distinction is I'm being overly abstract, but it's a way to actually disappear the fact that the studies that create the possibility of universal social science in the first place are based in places like the empirical study of India. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's one way I see that happening. And so one of the things that I find really interesting is if you look at the citations of what becomes modern social theory, how much people like Risley and how much these ideas of endogamy, right now I'm writing an essay on endogamy, these ideas are so important to how we understand our societies, but that category of endogamy happens because John McLennan says that we have to create a category to describe the fact that essentially Hindus marry each other, that certain castes marry each other. And then it becomes a way to define how we study society. And so I think East and West is being created as a false distinction. It's not really actually being distinguished.
Well, thank you so much for everyone's comments and just wonderful book that Durba wrote. And I haven't actually finished reading it, but I'm looking forward to reading it. I just had a kind of question out of curiosity, sort of thinking about this sort of dichotomy of East and West being kind of fictional in a way. Wonder if these categories that are being made of prostitute by the upper caste Hindu men include any women that are British or like that are residing in India, or like Indian women who marry British officials and go. I'm just thinking about this narrative of a Muslim woman who marries this colonial officer and goes to England and kind of refashion her identity as this like Mughal princess and kind of rise this tide differently. And so I wonder if these categories of people actually appear in this sort of thinking, or they're just completely outside this discourse.
So if it's by Hindu men, largely Hindu men, I think there is not as much of a concern of marrying or of interracial marriage, is what I would say. But in Durva Ghosh's work, for example, about the early 19th century, there is an extraordinary concern, and there is the category prostitute which emerges there. So if you look again in that 1810s version, the reason the East India Company is interested is because they're interested in British men who are having sexual relationships with Indian women. And so they're regulating it in part through these 1818 laws. That disappears largely after 1857, to go back to Kelvin's question. And so, not to say that, but those relationships become fewer and further between. They're not disappeared. And when they are happening, and when they're visible at least, they're quite elite. So I would say, I haven't ever seen that discourse, but that's not to say there isn't one. But Indian men are far more concerned with the reform of their own society, and not the fear of that their women would necessarily marry outside of the society. Far more concern of the idea that a high caste Hindu woman would marry a low caste or outcast man. Like that is, and that's to talk about the legacy of the thing, like that's really where it is, right? That intercaste marriage, the category that's used in social media today to describe any woman who marries in intercaste marriage, if you think about any communalist language, I mean, there's a reason that there's a really, really good misogyny army on Twitter of Hindu right-wing men. I mean, sorry, to be overly broad and descriptive, but it is a strategy that's part of a kind of Hindu nationalism from the beginning, is what I would say. I brought everyone down.
Far from it. You've given us so much to do.
Please.
I just buy your book. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'm from.
That's really nice.
I'm from China. I'm a scholar at Fudan University. I teach new media and gender studies. 10 years ago, I got Harvard Yanji Institute program. I came to here, and 3 years ago, I got Fulbright program. I came to here again. I'm really interested in your book, And I just got grant from Harvard Yanji Institute. I will launch New Media and Gender Studies workshop in China. Before I read your book, I don't know India situation about sexuality. We just know gender because Amir Khan, a very famous actor, we watch his film, we know rape events is very popular in India. And women has very lower position in India. But sexuality is a new problem. I want to invite you to come to China to join us, take part in this workshop. Yeah, because India is our neighbor, but there is very few studies in China. Yeah, in China, I haven't any question. I just want to let you know, in China, we haven't any same-sex marriage system. We haven't know to protect LGBT people, but it's very interesting that a lot of LGBT people just have their own life, such as lesbian group. I just done my field work for a lot of couples of lesbians. They take advantage of new media technology. They come to America to buy sperm from the back, and they have their own baby. But how to negotiate with each other? By whose sperm? You know, it's very interesting. They want to have the mixed baby, so they buy with the man sperm. And sometimes they ask the hospital to use their relatives' sperm to have baby. They have very radical revolution in China underground, even without any same-sex marriage. They live together and have their own baby, and they has a breakout. They want to let our babies has very close connections. So they just invite brothers or relatives to give them sperm. So it is a very radical revolution in China, but our government doesn't know this phenomenon.
I mean, I would say, I often think, like, what would the social scientists of, at least the Indian social scientists of my book, do if they knew that they could isolate their sperm? There would have been sperm banks for miles, because they really believed in the power of their manhood. And so that's something I could offer. But I do think that there is a story that you're describing that I think is really important, which is that one of the things that that I don't think this book tells the story of, is thinking about forms of desires that women do have, and how we tell the history of those forms of desires. In some ways, this book is a history of the limit of thinking about female desire, at least in this context. But I think that the work of Sharon Marcus, the work of others, have asked that question of how do we write the history of female friendship, of female desire, and how do we think about that intimacy of form? And what kind of methods are we supposed to use? In my archives, it's so entirely disappeared, but it's because the archives that I'm looking at don't allow for the possibility that women would have a desire for one another. But we know this from Indian feminist work, that actually the question of lesbian desire is critical in literature, in cultural production now, very much so, and certainly part of politics, certainly.
Thank you for this very thought-provoking discussion of your book, which admittedly I haven't read yet, but I promise I will soon. I found the comparisons between your work and Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments very thought-provoking. And it seems to me that there's maybe one key difference, which I was hoping you might speak about. And that difference is the notion of critical fabulation. As you were talking about your work, I sensed a desire to offer an alternative fiction, right, with which to build a future that we find desirable, in contrast to the fictions that your work elucidates as being masked by social scientific objectivity. Hartman, as she's thinking about Du Bois's power play in that regard, employs the method of critical fabulation to produce a different narrative that upon which we can perhaps build the future that we'd like. And it seems to me that in the final chapter of your book, as you described it, you're offering that kind of alternative narrative, but not in the form of critical fabulation. So I wonder if you've thought about critical fabulation, and if so, what you think about it in terms of your research.
So easy. I think you are exactly right in understanding the difference between the methods. And difference I think for many reasons. The types of texts that we're looking at are very different. The kinds of places where, especially in Wayward Lives, Hartman is finding possibility of narrating a different way. There's an absence of that kind of text of any kind, I think, in the archives that I look at. That's the first thing I would say. But to say that there's an absence of text, so therefore I can't do critical fabulation, would not be fully truthful, which is to say that, at least in this book, my project was to not ask about, rather it was to point out the limit of asking what it means to talk about wayward lives when we didn't know that those lives themselves were so productive of systems of knowledge. And so in some ways, the book is a history of modern social science rather than a history of women. And it doesn't purport to be a history of women, if that makes sense. And so that's why I try to make that figurative move. You will not find a history of women who are involved in sexual commerce here. That doesn't mean that there aren't women in the story. In fact, I try to illuminate any site or any moment that there is. So, for example, when there is a case after the Contagious Diseases Act of a woman who describes herself as not a prostitute in a legal case, Sukumoni Roar, as she is described in an archive, I quote her, and from the legal case as it's accounted for, I am not a prostitute, nor have I ever been. Now, how am I supposed to read that? The first thing I would say is her name, as it's inscribed in an archive, is Sukumoni Rar. Rar, or Randi, would mean, in the way I would understand the transliteration, means prostitute. Or that's a translation that's happening from the late 19th century on. So her name in the archive is prostitute already. And that's one of the things that I have found over and over again. The copy editor of the book kept saying, why do you call women by their first name and not their last name? And it's because the Colonial Archive inscribes their last name again and again. So Rar, and in another chapter I talk about a woman named Kali Bewa. Bewa is a colloquial term for widow. And so even the subjecthood itself is inscribed in the same logic. And so the difficulty of whatever critical fabulation is, that's a writerly concern for me. I think part of it is I wanted, as a writer, to confront the limit of it. And to say, by confronting the limit, here's a system of knowledge built on this limit. Yeah. I think there is another book to be written that could employ Hartman's articulation of critical fabulation. I think it has different political concerns. And that's not to say I don't, but one of the things that a scholar in India said to me is that, when you say that the prostitute is not a prostitute, prostitute is not a sex worker. For example, a sex worker organizations that I went to in Calcutta when I started my field work, they have a history book that they use in their brochure. It's an NGO, and their NGO's brochure begins with the history of the prostitute, and it tells the same history about all of these prostitutes in Indian history as sex work. from the Kama Sutra onto modern society. And my project doesn't allow, it's not an easy liberatory project, I think, in that way. Meaning, I'm not saying Saidiya Hartman's is either, at all. But simply to say that I don't think that there is a project of saying by recuperating their lives, we can have a different political present. In some ways, I'm saying, I think we have to imagine different ways to have a political present for women by thinking about this system of social thought, rather than by saying we can recuperate lives. Yeah, thank you.
There are no more questions. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you so much.